I'm Professor Jeff Troxell. I work in the Strategic Studies Institute. I've been here at the Army War College for about 18 years. In that capacity, I've taught an elective on the economics of national security. And so over the years, I got involved in expanding that a little bit to delve into the Chinese economy. So I've been given a lecture on the Chinese economy for about 9 years, 8 to 9 years, and a lot has changed in that time. So now in addition to being in the Strategic Studies Institute, I'm also a proud affiliate of Seminar 16. All right, so I had to get that plug in there. So I got my paid audiences here, so I appreciate that. Now, the other thing that I've done this past year, there's a team of 4 faculty members and 15 highly engaged students that spent a year, yeah, we got a couple of folks here in the crowd from that spent a year examining U.S. strategy vis-a-vis Asia Pacific. And so that's another part of this China talk and some updated issues that I've included in this current version of the presentation. In fact, 10 days ago, we came back from a week-long visit to China, Beijing, and Shanghai, talking with some of the top think tanks, as well as a couple of their top universities, counterparts in those organizations, about U.S.-China relationships, and I've reflected some of that in this updated pitch. Now, are there any economists in the group? Anybody brave enough to claim they're an economist? Okay, I likewise am not an economist. I mean, I've been working this issue, but I don't have a PhD in economics or any of that sort of thing. So if we have any real tough questions, we'll have to defer them to somebody else, but it won't be necessarily me. But you all know why God created economists, correct? No, so weather forecasters wouldn't feel so bad. So that's the one joke of the presentation. So if you didn't like that one, I'm sorry, you might as well go find another spot. Okay, we got a lot of ground to cover, so let me go through this probably fairly rapidly because I want to give some time for Q&A as we get into this. Now, if you're interested in China, presumably, or you wouldn't be here, there's so much out there written about China. And so this is just, a collection of some of the latest books out there. And you see it's the full spectrum, from China's going to dominate the world to China's on the verge of collapse. This presentation is going to be somewhat in the middle, sort of reflecting some of these authors that are here in the middle. And so my view is China's probably going to muddle through, and they've got a lot of muddling to do. And so we're going to talk about that, and hopefully that'll come out as we go along here. Okay, so here's the agenda. We're going to start with context. I think context is really very important. If you want to understand a strategic issue of any import, I think you need to know the context. And so we're going to start with context, a little bit about geopolitics, geoeconomics, the rise of China, and some comparative economics, and I know that'll put everybody to sleep, but it won't be that long, but it's very important when you think about this. And then I'm going to spend time just talking about one issue, trade. I think that's the issue that President Trump has really highlighted. Some challenges, we'll then broaden it back out again to look at some overall challenges that China faces, and then come up with the U.S. response. So one of the things to think about, this is our see if I get him to pop up here. Our late great strategist, Yogi Berra, the future ain't what it used to be. And so when you think about the U.S.-China relationship, that clearly holds. I mean, I've said just in the last 8 or 9 years that I've been giving this lecture, the situation has changed pretty dramatically. And you can go back another decade prior to that, and it's really changed a lot. So there are a couple points that I want to make just right up front. That the relationship, America's relationship with China, I think is going to define the 21st century. I mean, this is the two great powers right now, and I think it's going to define the 21st century. And their relations are going to be much more subtle and dynamic than a lot of people may think. So this is Yogi Berra. It's very dynamic. The future ain't what it used to be. And then the final point, and I think this is very important too, and we're sort of going to close out with this, there's nothing inevitable about either China's rise or the outcome of this competition, U.S. and China. Nothing inevitable. And I know there's a lot of discussion out there. Well, maybe there is. All right, so geopolitics. And I see I've got my good friend and colleague, Dr. David Lai, in the group. And he's done a lot of writing on the power transition, and you see power transition is noted down here, and that's a lot of what the concern is. Here's the United States status quo power, and you've got the rise of China. And what does that foretell in terms of the international order, in terms of international relations? So we spent a lot of time at the War College reading this guy, Thucydides, about the Polynesian, or the Peloponnesian, not the Polynesian, the Peloponnesian War. And so he's got this quote here about the rise of Athens and the fear that it inspired in Sparta, and that made war inevitable. So that's known as the Thucydides trap. So you've got this power transition at work. The rising power is going to threaten the status quo power. War is going to result. So lots of examples. The Guns of August, 1914, the rise of Germany threatens the status quo power of Great Britain. World War I breaks out. Graham Allison's got a brand new book out, just recently published, and he's talking about destined for war, examples about the Thucydides trap. So we're going to see how that plays out. Now, the fear of China, I think, is sort of captured in this little cover from The Economist magazine. And I think this fear is largely driven by economics. And we're going to come to that. But this is not only do we fear China, but we also think China cheats. We don't trust China. And so that's a problem when we're thinking about trying to manage this relationship. So this China cheats poster here came from the 2008 Democratic primary in Pennsylvania, the last big primary between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And so a lot of discussion about China and trade and all these kind of issues. So this is the notion here from Leslie Geld that this is what nations fear. They fear Chinese influence as a result of economic power. Even Graham Allison, in his recent book, says yes. You know, going a little bit faster here, but the aggravating the possible march toward war is China's economic growth. So my argument in this presentation is going to be that geopolitics is certainly very important, but we need to focus on this relationship if we're really interested in managing the rise of China, managing the relationship between the U.S. and China. We need to focus on geoeconomics, the use of economic interest in support of national interest. And I think that's where we're going to come, and we'll talk about this. Lots of challenges in doing that, but I think there are major opportunities for us when we focus on it from that perspective. All right, so let's talk about the rise of China. So a picture's worth 1,000 words. Those of us that went to China 10 days or came back from Shanghai, we got to see this. So anybody in the audience been to Shanghai? Okay, so you know what's coming. So this is 1990, depending on when you've been there. 1990, looking from the Bund across to the Pudong area of China, and here it is 20 years later. 20 years later, same shot, essentially. So there it is, 20 years, the rise of China. And that's what it looks like. So in that period of time, about 700 million Chinese have moved out of extreme poverty. 300 million Chinese have moved into the middle class. There are 1 million millionaires in China. It's the world's second largest economy, and a 15-fold increase in their economy, 10% growth over 3 decades. That's the rise of China in a picture. Now here it is in a chart. So we see that red line there, and we see that China has certainly increased their position. And now this is a projection when you look out here, but this is the upward tick. And so there's some key time period here where we see this rise of China. And some key dates, so 1976. So what's the best thing that Mao did for China? He died and got out of the way. Now that's a theory, I know not everybody may appreciate that, but 1979, Deng Xiaoping comes in and he starts the reform process. 1989, Tiananmen Square. So this is not an economic event, but it's a huge political event, obviously, Tiananmen Square. Followed closely by various color revolutions in the former Soviet Socialist republics. So of major interest to the leadership in China. So just, keep that in mind when you think about that context. 1997, the Asian financial crisis. Big deal in Southeast Asia, not just Southeast Asia. I mean, it affected countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, started in Thailand, all the way to Korea. And it really caused in that region of the world, to include China, a little bit of discomfort about our international financial institutions. The IMF, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, they eventually came to the rescue of these countries, but they imposed very draconian conditions. 2001, China enters the World Trade Organization. 2008, the global financial crisis. This is a big turning point, this 2008 timeframe. And if you recall back to David Lai's power transition, maybe we're moving into the stage 2 now, where China's power is viewed, China's economic power is viewed. But not only is China rising, but this is a huge hit to capitalism, the US capitalist model, the Washington Consensus about how countries are supposed to operate. Now the thought is, well, maybe the Washington Consensus isn't so good after all, because look what happened, and this all started in the US. Maybe there's something like a Beijing Consensus. So maybe state control of the economy is not such a bad thing. The other thing that this does is this causes in the Chinese mind that, a Chinese strategist says, well, maybe our day is going to arrive where we can overtake the United States a lot sooner than we thought. So 2008 is a big point to think about. Okay, here's a little bit of Econ 101. And I know you've all had Econ 101, near and dear to your heart. So GDP, gross domestic product, it's made up of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So here's what it looks like for the US and China. So US, largest economy in the world, lots of consumption, a little bit of investment, substantial amount of government spending. And right now we've got a trade imbalance, current account deficit. Here's China. Notice the difference? So this line up here for the United States is very typical of developed nations, high-income nations. We are based on consumption-based economies. Most of our economic activity is based on consumption. China, not so much. China is out, people would argue, is out of balance from that particular perspective. So let me show you a couple of other statistics here. Population, much different scale. We'll talk a little bit about demographics eventually. And the GDP per capita is much different as well. So when we think about China, so this is reflected in this investment. China's investment portion of its GDP has gone up tremendously. As a result of the 2008 financial crisis, China had a bigger stimulus, fiscal stimulus, for investment than we did in the United States. And there's all this political concern about our fiscal investment in the United States. China had more. So investment is up, household spending is down. Another big difference that doesn't show up, but you can derive it here, if consumption is way down, savings is extremely high in China. They're saving a lot. Part of that is they're not spending a whole lot on social services, so the Chinese have got to save for their old age, save for their health care and those kind of things. So there are some differences there. All right, let me talk about this dual identity. Two aspects of the dual identity. The first is, as shown here, actually from a purchasing power parity perspective, which represents relative prices in countries. So if you got a poorer country, the relative prices are lower in that country, so their income goes further. So in a purchasing power perspective, China is already the #1 economy. So that's a developed nation. But this is this extreme poverty rate. I mentioned almost 700 million Chinese out of extreme poverty. And now here we are, 2010, 12%. Wow, I mean, that's a great looking chart. 12% of 1.4 billion is more than half of our entire population. So this dual identity is China is a developed nation and it's a developing nation. So China will argue that we still need to have some special consideration given to our developing status. A lot of that played out in the Paris Accord, Paris Climate Accords, and we're not going to necessarily get into that today, but that's the first dual identity. So the second dual identity is, I mentioned the reforms in 1979. So China reforms its economy, and they start to move capitalism with Chinese characteristics. So you have a private sector. The private sector grows, and that attributes a lot to that growth that I showed early on the Chinese economy. But they also have a very large state sector of the economy. So the dual identity is a private market-based economy and a state-based economy, state-controlled economy. Lots of state-owned enterprises, lots of excess capacity, and an increasing debt problem, and the banking industry. The banking industry is essentially all controlled by China. Okay, one more thing to talk about here, political economy. So when you think about political economy, that's sort of the notion that how does a nation state decide how to allocate resources? Is it going to rely on the market, or is it going to rely on the state, the government? So, United States, most developing nations, most Western nations, we rely primarily on the market. I know there's a lot of government regulation, there's a lot of government policies, but primarily market-based. China, not so much. China is still, as I mentioned, that dual identity. The state sector, the state control, even the state control of the private sector in China is pretty tremendous. The Communist Party of China has got representatives in a lot of these private firms, and so there's still an awful lot of control. So the number one charge for Xi Jinping is to keep the Communist Party of China in control, in command. The legitimacy right now comes largely from the performance of the economy. But if there's any kind of discussion between, okay, are we going to go towards economic issues or security issues, security's always going to get the call. All right, so that's your comparative economics, and it's important to sort of remember this for context. All right, let's talk about trade. Okay, so here we go. There's trade. You know, I think it's really interesting when you look at this cartoon, Secretary of Commerce Ross and the newly confirmed U.S. Trade Representative Lighthizer have both argued that the number one thing we should do in trade is do no harm. So I don't know about this cartoon and doing no harm, but okay, so here's what the president said. Now this is in the campaign. This is campaign rhetoric. So this is his tweet up here. You know, they're robbing us blind, trade deficits, they're stealing our jobs, it's just terrible. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to narrow the trade deficit, we're going to create jobs. So this trade is trade deficit as the metric, but it's creating jobs is what it's all about. And we're going to talk about that. Withdrawal from TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, apply tariffs, and China, of course, is a currency manipulator. We all know that. Terrible folks. And actually, that's probably how he would say it in a tweet. Just terrible, but at any rate. Okay, so here we go. By the way, none of this is new. So when we think about campaign rhetoric and trade issues in the United States, I mean, for the entire 21st century, you know, all 17 years of it, actually going back another decade, we've been talking about trade issues in our major presidential campaigns. So there's nothing new here in reality over the years. All right, so let's talk about trade. So we're going to talk about China, and the first thing on the supply side. And so this was the concern, you know, the concern that people had, oh, wow, China enters the WTO in 2001, exports take off, and it becomes the world's workshop. And what happens to the United States? Our current account deficit, our trade imbalance goes into the tank. So that's the argument. That's the concern that we have with China about this huge imbalance in trade. Last year, 2016, $346 billion. That's actually an improvement over 2015. It's about $20 billion less of a deficit than it was in 2015. They are our number 3 export market for the United States. So that doesn't compare with this column here, but that's still an awful lot of exports that we do annually with China, and they are our number 1 source of imports. Now, a couple things to mitigate that picture right there. First of all, you know, when you look at this chart over here, yeah, we've got a huge trade imbalance with China, but over the since 1990, we've had a huge trade imbalance with the Pacific Basin. are the Pacific Rim countries. So back here, most of this blue column represented, any guesses? Japan. So really, you look at the top here, and our trade imbalance with the Pacific Rim is about what it's been for, a quarter of a century. But it's just sort of, shifted from other nations, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, whatever, to China. So that mitigates it a little bit. The other thing to consider is this. A lot of those exports that we get from China are coming from foreign invested enterprises. Not all U.S., but a lot of U.S. firms are invested in China. They're making products, and they are, in turn, exporting them to the United States. If you look at high technology exports, about 82% of them come from foreign invested enterprises. And so there's a little bit of mitigation there. This is this globally integrated economy at work here. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about manufacturing. I'm going to introduce the issue here, and then we're going to come back to it in a little bit. The Smiley curve. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Smiley curve. I was first introduced to the Smiley curve reading James Fallows in the Atlantic Monthly. And so the argument is that the money in manufacturing is on the upper ends of the smile. It's the brand, it's the ideas, the design, and then it's the sales and the contracts. Down here, manufacturing and assembly, you're just putting the pieces together. No real money in that. So what's happened in 21st century manufacturing is that manufacturing is now a commodity. It's been disaggregated, supply chains, and China just happens to be the location for final assembly. But there's not much value in the final assembly. And so what that generates when you think about trade statistics, here's an example, and a lot of you are probably familiar with this. So this is Apple and the iPhone. So this is the global supply network for Apple. So it's designed in California, United States. Bits and pieces that go into the iPhone come from all over the world, Asia, Europe, goes to China for final assembly, gets shipped across the world. So what that equates to for the United States, they imported, this data is from 2009, they exported 11 million iPhones to the United States. That's an export value of 2.0 billion, so that adds to our trade deficit. But when you consider that 96.4% of the value comes from someplace else, instead of a $2 billion deficit to China, it really should only be about a $73.5 million. The statistics can really drive a different type of analysis. So the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and the World Trade Organization, they've done analysis, and they said, the U.S. trade deficit with China should actually be about 35% less than what it appears in the current statistics. So the Trump administration can claim victory. We've already decreased the trade deficit by 35%. But that's just a way to think about this, because the new way globalization and global manufacturing has changed so much the statistics hasn't kept up with it. Kept up with. All right, so that was supply side. Now let's look a little bit about demand side. So demand side, everybody wants to be in on the China market. Emerging markets have more consumers than the United States. The spending spree in China, and we got to see that when we were there for a week, clearly well off in Beijing and Shanghai. And then this notion here, the $10 trillion prize. And the argument on the $10 trillion prize, that's consumer spending between the rising middle class in China and India. Everybody wants to be in that market. So we've got some supply side issues in terms of where things are made, but we want to be in on the demand side as well. Okay, so there's manufacturing competition. We're in a competition with China. We know that. That's this fear of China. And China now is the largest manufacturing nation in the world. So we've seen that. They've overtaken us several years ago. However, the wage benefit that China has used to its advantage is disappearing. Wages are going up in China, so the cost of labor is going up significantly in China, and that's going to have an impact. So we've got this notion of manufacturing renaissance in the United States, and you can just sort of read through some of the stuff. The energy revolution is huge in America in terms of driving down cost. So the offshoring and now is becoming reshoring to a certain extent. So that's one notion. The United States, we're doing pretty good here. China reads the same stuff that we read. So in 2015, China knows what the Smiley curve is all about. They don't want to just be down there being metal bangers and putting stuff together with not a whole lot of value added. They want to get in this innovation deal, and we're going to come back to this issue in a little bit. 2015, they came up with China 2025. And really what they're pushing here is not so much made in China, but made by China. So they're trying to get up in the innovation areas in the higher parts of the global production chain. So they're working it. So the competition is hard at work here. There's good news and bad news for the United States. We talk about this third industrial revolution, the new industrial revolution, all this adaptive manufacturing, 3D printers, collaborative manufacturing, automation. And you look at this chart here, U.S. has an advantage in that. So that's the good news. In fact, a recent report from Deloitte and Touche says that by 2020, the projection is the United States is going to regain the #1 spot. Now, this is a projection, whether or not it happens in the next 3 years, but it just tells you how competitive this is. That's the good news. The bad news is people say that in the future, factories are going to have 2 employees. They're going to have one person, man or woman, and a dog. And the person is there to feed the dog. The dog is there to keep the person away from the machines. So the bad news is about this this third industrial revolution or the fourth industrial revolution and this new manufacturing coming back to the United States. It doesn't have many jobs. And a lot of people talk about that. So yeah, trade has a huge impact on employment, but not nearly as much as automation. Automation is what's really driven down manufacturing jobs in the United States. We are manufacturing about 4 times as much as we did in the 1960s, 1970s, and we're doing it with less than a quarter of the labor. We're manufacturing almost as much as China, and we're doing it with about 10% of the labor that China has. So automation is the key when you think about manufacturing. So as a society, we need to come to grips with that to a certain extent. Okay, when you talk about trade and the president, currency manipulation is another issue here. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time. We got any foreign exchange traders out there? Didn't think you'd want to raise your hand on that one, but that's a tough one. Okay, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on currency manipulation, but let's just get to the bottom line. So the Treasury Department puts out biannually in April and October, generally, this report on foreign exchange rates. Foreign exchange policies are of our major trading partners. Incidentally, this is an excellent report to give you a good summary on what's going on in the macroeconomics in the United States as well as globally. Very good report. So a lot of people were anticipating, okay, this is the first one from the Trump administration. They are surely going to say that China is a currency manipulator. Well, not so fast. So here's what they said. Nobody is currently manipulating their currency that meets the standards here. China's current account surplus is in fact decreasing. So things are getting better from the standpoint of that huge surplus that China had. In the 2010 timeframe, it was about 10% of their GDP. Now it's down to 1.8% that's shown there. In fact, China is actually intervening in the exchange markets, but they're doing it to strengthen the RMB, not to devalue it. So it's one of those things, be careful what you ask for. We always say in the United States, your currency ought to be market-based. But if it was market-based, the international markets right now are down on China, on their currency. So the currency would devalue. That makes Chinese exports that much cheaper. So, but we don't mind China intervening in their currency market when they're trying to strengthen the currency. So it's not necessarily an issue right now. So that's currency manipulation. Okay, so let's broaden it out a little bit. China's economy. So this is the issue here in terms of China's got a lot of problems. People are trying to figure out, is it going to be a soft landing or a hard landing? Is it going to be a landing? Is it going to be soft or hard? So this is a report from Richard Sharma, who's the chief global strategist at Morgan Stanley. He says, China is now a threat to the United States, not because it is strong, but because it is fragile. So that's just something to think about in terms of what happens if the Chinese economy crashes, what happens if things don't go so well in China. So this is the growth. growth projections. The projection here from just a couple years ago is that China's growth is going to decrease fairly dramatically and become very similar to the United States. I mean, if it becomes a developed nation, a richer nation, its rate of growth is automatically going to decrease. They can't keep up at the 10% or now the 6.5%. And the statistics, people say that in the PRC, one of their top manufacturing industries is statistics. So there's a lot of thought about, can we trust these numbers? So this is the official number, about close to 7%. The unofficial number has it down below 5%. So China's growth is decelerating. That's a huge issue for the Chinese economy. Some of that's driven by this other notion here. This is a key concept of this particular presentation, the middle income trap. So the middle income trap says that China, this is how China grew, this Asian development model. They took advantage of low-hanging fruit, low-skilled labor, low wages, low-tech manufacturing, exports. The banks mobilized resources for investment because the state owns all the banks, and they grew very rapidly. And now they're into this, they're into this middle income level. But the World Bank did a study. They did it in conjunction with China. It's the study's China 2030. And they looked at 101 countries that hit the middle income level in 1960. And by 2008, so that's almost 50 years later, only 13 of those 101 countries moved into a high income status. So the middle income trap, I guess it's like a sand trap. You get in it and you can't get out. And so China now is facing the middle income trap. And so how do they get out of the trap now? There's some nations that have made it. And we can talk about that perhaps in Q&A, what some of the thought is there. But what that means is, we've talked about the U.S. rebalance to Asia Pacific. Secretary Clinton announced it, President Obama talked about it. I mean, that was one of the things that we were doing in our special project this year. What about the rebalance? The rebalance of the Chinese economy is even more important. And so they've got to go from an economy that was based on, if you remember that Econ 101, investment, capital investment, they've got to go to more consumption. So what do? How do you get more consumption from your people, from your population? Well, you got to increase wages. Well, you increase wages, and now your manufacturing is less competitive, but that's what you got to do. You also got to provide more social services, so they're saving less. If you have a 50% savings rate, that's not going to increase consumption. So what you end up doing is the ordinary Chinese and small businesses need to benefit disproportionately from these reforms. That's really hard to do. Now, China knows all about this. Xi Jinping knows about this. I mean, all their technocrats know all about this. And so this is this notion about the man who must change China. This is a brief or a quote from the New Yorker from a couple years ago. And you see what the thought process is there. Ambassador John Huntsman, who was the former ambassador to China and the current chairman of the Atlantic Council, he said this about Xi Jinping. He says, Xi Jinping wakes up every morning and his number one priority is domestic stability. Remember that political economy thing we talked about? If he can't keep 1.4 billion people calm, employed, at peace, the whole system falls apart. So that's his concern. His concern is the strength of the economy. And they're trying lots of different things to try to get things going. They talk the talk about decisive role for the market, loosen capital controls, all these kind of things, and they're struggling. So these are some of the broad challenges that they have. And when's the bubble going to burst? I mean, that's what the Time magazine cover is all about. Demographics, the 1-2-4 problem. They've recently relaxed the one-child policy, but it's going to take time for that to permeate through their demographic profile. So you have one child, supports 2 parents, supports 4 grandparents. That's tough on that one child. We know how hard it is when we look at our Social Security projections and we figure out that, wow, there are fewer and fewer workers supporting all the retirees. So that's a huge demographic problem that they have. Pollution is a tremendous problem, and I think you probably all read about that. Inequality is growing in China. Urbanization, the social reform, corruption, All of those things compound the problems that the Chinese government has in making those economic reforms. So this is just a little bit about this comprehensive economic reform. Some of the social reforms. You know, they've got this hukou system there that essentially, in order to get social services in an urban environment, you've got to have a pass. You've got to have like a passport that says you're from that city. If you're a migrant into that urbanization process and in all these big factories that have been built, but you don't have a pass, you don't get any social services. So they're trying to change that. But it's really expensive for these local governments to now have to pay for all that. And at the same time that's happening, your middle class is growing larger and larger, putting more and more demands on the system. So they've got a lot of issues. Debt, Moody's just recently, within the last couple of weeks, downgraded their sovereign debt level. And that's some of the things that they talked about. We're concerned about their growth. We're concerned about the liabilities that are on the system. China says, don't worry about it. I think we can handle it. But that is something that everybody's watching, the debt. Okay, so what do we do about it? Just a couple minutes to talk about the U.S. response to all of this, to the trade considerations, to these macro problems that we talked about. So we got this high-stakes poker game. This is from an economist from a couple years ago. President Obama, and he's playing poker with Xi Jinping and Putin. Well, we got a new player in the game, and so we're going to see how this works out. And so my argument now is, in this high-stakes game, you know, we got to apply this geoeconomics. This is the way we ought to approach this relationship, U.S.-China relationship. And so we need to use our economic instruments to promote national interests, trade, investment, monetary policy. It's not a zero-sum game, and this needs to be more from a cooperative approach. So that's geoeconomics. Now remember, what are they playing here? You know, they're playing high-stakes poker. They're not playing solitaire, right? So China has a voice in this too. This is not just the United States trying to figure out what the international order is going to be. We got other big nations out there that are thinking about what the international order should be. So China uses the term strategic economy, and they talk about employing their financial resources to gain influence, to increase their influences. Lots of examples. I mean, you go back to 2012 and the rare earth issue with Japan, banana boycott against the Philippines, and just recently, you know, the U.S., what do? You know, a security move, we put THAAD, a THAAD battery in South Korea to guard against the North Korean missiles. So what does China do? China boycotts Lotte, because Lotte provided the golf course for us to put the THAAD battery. So that's economic, you know, that's strategic economy. Some people would say that's economic warfare. So the Chinese are in the game, we got to get in the game. So, and we're off to a decent start. You know, this was the Mar-a-Lago visit in April between our two presidents, and they came up with the U.S.-China Comprehensive Dialogue. I mean, I just love these administrations. So the Bush administration, Bush 43, had the Strategic Economic Dialogue. President Obama comes in and he says, oh, we got to change the name. So it became the Strategic and Economic Dialogue. And now President Trump says, oh, I don't want any of that stuff, so we're going to have the comprehensive dialogue. Well, whatever you call it. Anyway, so they're off to a start. And so you got all that campaign rhetoric. You got the trade war threats that the president sort of laid out there. And now we've got this comprehensive, and you can see what the 4 pillars are. You know, this is some of the cybersecurity stuff that Mr. Sanger was talking about today. The comprehensive economic dialogue. In May, the 10th of May, so several weeks ago, and the Chinese were all over this when we visited China and talked to them. This 100-day plan was a big deal for them. Say, hey, we're making progress here, and this was just announced by Secretary Ross, Commerce. Here's what he says about China relations. Pretty interesting when you think about that quote. When you think about how bad things were during the campaign and how things started out a little bit rocky, well, now evidently we're doing great. And this is part of this 10-point plan, or 100-day plan, 4 points. So we're making progress. I mean, there is some progress there, and so that should be encouraging. And now they're talking about, let's go for a 1-year plan. Maybe go for a free trade agreement with China. That would be pretty tough. But we've been working for years and years on a bilateral investment treaty, so maybe that's a little bit easier. Reciprocity, level playing field, that's what we're after. Okay, but there's other competition out there, geoeconomic. And so we got these multilateral trade agreements. And so there's three that are over here, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Then there's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that doesn't include the United States. That's sort of talked about as the Chinese counter to the TPP. But really the origin of the RCEP is ASEAN. And then we got the free trade area of the Asia Pacific. You know, that's sort of a long shot. So TPP, an economic program, does it have geostrategic implications? Absolutely. So here's former Secretary of Defense, you pass the TPP and that's like giving me another carrier in the Asia Pacific. Well, not so fast. This is one of those campaign promises that the president stuck with. TPP's gone. And I think we should shed a tear because I think that's my personal view. I know Jeff Zazer sitting there wrote a paper about the economic issues in Asia Pacific and he shares that view. But let's not lose all heart. I think there's some residuals that could come out of this. The president says, I don't want multilateral trade deals, but I'm willing to make all kinds of bilateral deals. And so, he met with Prime Minister Abe. Maybe there's a possibility for a U.S.-Japan free trade agreement. The hard negotiating's been done because Japan and the U.S. were in the TPP. So that negotiation has been done. So now we just got to continue to pull that off as a bilateral agreement. The president just met the beginning of this week with the Prime Minister of Vietnam. And so you can see some of the language here. We got trade deals going on. This guy's doing a great job, particularly in categories in trade and other things. So maybe we can knit something together with some of these other nations. We already have a free trade agreement with Korea, Australia, and Singapore. So, we're playing in that arena. And so maybe it's not all bad. And then I think this is pretty interesting down here. The administration just sent to Congress their guidance on how they're going to renegotiate NAFTA. And a lot of the provisions came from the TPP. Comprehensive trade agreement, high standards, all these different areas. So maybe we're going to capture some of that work. Secretary of Commerce Ross, who's is the point man for trade in this administration, recently said, I think maybe we can make the TTIP work. So the TTIP is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. It's sort of the counterpart, the European, US-EU counterpart to the TPP. So maybe we can salvage some of this multilateral stuff. And there was recently a meeting of the TPP 11 in Hanoi, and our US trade representative was there. And so there's still talk going on. So we might be able to salvage some things from the TPP. Here's another issue about geoeconomics, One Belt, One Road, or the Belt Road Initiative. And so this is the big $1 trillion infrastructure investment plan that China has put on the table. Came out in 2013, and now it's really gotten a lot of press, a lot of emphasis from Xi Jinping. This is his major international initiative. And there's lots of reasons behind it. It's their pivot to the west. So initially, this is the belt, the land routes, and this is the road. I know that doesn't necessarily make sense, but the maritime routes are the road, and the belts are the land routes. And so there's lots of reasons why they're doing this, absorb excess capacity of all those zombie state-owned enterprises that we talked about. That's one of the things. But the geostrategic component, and that's something to be concerned about too. But China's not the only one. There's huge needs for infrastructure in this region of the world. So when you come across this, I found this pretty fascinating. South Korea's got a plan. India's got a plan. Japan, of course, has a plan. And ASEAN's got a plan. So everybody wants to build infrastructure. So it may not be such a bad thing for us to cooperate with China on certain aspects of the One Belt, One Road, because they're all after the same thing. But we got to be careful. So 13, 14 May in Beijing, they had this Belt and Road Forum. Now, it's funny that the U.S. representatives say, oh, yeah, the Belt and Road Forum. The acronym for that is B-A-R-F, BARF. It's actually, we got to take it a little bit more serious than that. So this was the bridge that they were creating there in Beijing. And so this is the statement that President Xi Jinping makes about the Belt and Road Forum and the One Belt, One Road. It's going to foster a new type of international relations, win-win cooperation. Globalization, he's talked about it being globalization 2.0. This is the way forward, cooperative relationships, and we're going to create a new international security framework. So the red flags ought to go up when we think about this. You know, that's the geostrategic component. So we got to play in this game. So what do we do about it? U.S. options, I think we got two. Either we push back real hard, trade war, protectionism, containment, grudgingly support the international order, or we do something like this: inclusive economic order, enforce the rules, use geoeconomic tools, and enhance the foundations of U.S. economic strength. So there's another recent book that came out that talked about, see if I get this thing to click, economic interdependence and war. So if there's one thing you should figure out, our two economies are really knit pretty tightly together on those trade relationships, on those investment relationships. And so this author says that because of that interdependence, nations won't go to war as long as you consider these three things, this trade expectation theory. Avoid trade security spiral. So if China feels threatened by Malacca, the Straits of Malacca, which they probably do because the U.S. Navy is out there patrolling the Straits of Malacca, and all of their oil from the Persian Gulf comes through that Strait of Malacca. If they really feel threatened by that, then that's going to increase the potential for conflict. Think back to 1940, 1941, U.S.-Japan, when the United States starts to clamp down on oil exports to Japan, on scrap steel going to Japan. Now Japan's trade expectation is that, wow, we can't count on us getting that stuff because the United States is going to stop it. So war becomes the result in 1941. We got to have a cooperative attitude, no containment, and that develops a positive long-term view, and so that should work out. So that's the thought about this interdependence, if we do cooperate, and I think it's in our interest to do that. And so this notion here, Tom Friedman, in his book, The World is Flat, makes the argument about the Dell theory of conflict prevention. In his first book on the economy, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, excellent book on globalization, by the way. So if you're looking for a good book, I mean, and he's a great writer. He's that's what he does. He's a journalist. So that was the McDonald's theory of conflict prevention. No two nations will go to war if they had McDonald's. Well, we had to scrap that theory because we bombed Serbia, and Belgrade had a McDonald's at that time. So now he's come up with the Dell theory of conflict prevention. And this ties in with what we've talked about, these integrated supply chains, mutual assured production. No two nations can afford to go to war with each other if they are involved in these integrated supply chains. We got to rely on our strengths. We got to fight through this. We got all this stuff in our favor. If you want to be a leader of a major country, the U.S. or China, and you're looking at economic issues, we got a lot of huge economic issues in the United States. But we are in much, much better shape. I mean, that's the argument that I've been making, and hopefully you recognize that. We are in much, much better shape than is China in terms of the huge issues that China faces. All right, so here's the final exam. So just sort of skim through that. U.S. economy comatose, current slump remains longest, dislocations, jobs down, debt overhang, all this kind of stuff, banking collapse, real estate depression, so when was that? Somebody knows. Somebody must have been in my earlier lecture. 1992. Let's see if we got it here. 1992. Who were we concerned about? Japan. Okay, here's the coming war with Japan. So that was our big economic competitor. The Soviet Union is gone. Japan's our huge economic competitor. This is what it looked like. Wow, look at that, 71% of our GDP. Japan's eating our lunch. Toyota, all that stuff. Well, it didn't play out that way, did it? Japan hits a financial crisis, a banking crisis, and now Japan's in a deep slump. 2 decades worth of a slump. I'm not saying that's going to happen to China, but that's just this notion that nothing is inevitable. All right, so we just got a couple minutes before I got to send you back up to seminar. What are your questions?
Jeff, if I can jump in
right
here.
Yeah.
Demographics. So the assumption was that when China relaxed their one-child policy, that their birth rate would go up. That has not proved to be the case. I mean, your number there of 1.5 is still below replacement level. So the implications of that economically, and then from your most recent trip, can you talk about, I mean, what does the PLA say about the 40 years of one-child policy, how that contributes to their ability to wage war?
I mean, demographics is a huge problem for them. I mean, the other thing that we didn't talk about, but they've got this huge gender imbalance. So if you're a Chinese couple and you're relying on this one child to take care of you, what do you want to have? Do you want to have a little baby boy or do you want to have a little baby girl? Oh, by the way, you want your family name to continue, so you want to have a little baby boy. So the other thing about this demographic thing is they've got a huge imbalance of more men and fewer women. And the demographers that I've read say they don't know how that's going to work out. They've never seen a population, demographic, pyramid that looks that way, that's so out of balance. So that's one issue. A second issue that's related to that, if you got one dear son in your family, now this is a concern, but I don't want to overblow it. But it's the last thing you want to do is send that young man off to war and risk his life someplace. So, like I said, I don't want to overplay that, but that's a concern. But also this demographics, so their working age population is already decreasing. So you think about this huge labor advantage that China has. But because of their pyramid, their demographic pyramid, their working age population is already on the decrease. Now, it's nothing like Japan. Japan's from a demographic perspective, Japan's a real basket case. So it's a problem now. So they've relaxed the one-child policy. And I know that, the one-child policy wasn't necessarily sacrosanct anyway. But it's going to take a while, and this is what the argument is, for the society to decide, oh, we want bigger families. You just don't turn that on a dime because people are living the style that they've gotten used to now and driving nice fancy German cars and all this other kind of stuff, and they're sending kids off to nice schools in the United States, and it becomes a lot more expensive. It's one thing to do that for one child, it's a lot more expensive to do it for two. So it's going to take a time for that to work its way through the system. So it's a big constraint for them, demographics. What else? Yes, sir.
So in the event of war with China, assuming all trade immediately stopped, who would get hurt worse? And how would that play out?
Well, it'd be interesting to sort of figure that one out. There's been some discussion, when the Trump administration was coming in, there was a lot of this talk about a trade war. So we're going to have this trade war, 45% tariffs, currency manipulation, all that kind of stuff. And then the thought, well, okay, who's going to suffer more? So I don't know, so the analysis is not too deep into that. But generally, the thought is that China would suffer more than the United States, because the United States, you just look at the figures there for our current account balance. Our trade deficit is 0.5% of our economy. So trade is important for us, but not necessarily that important, and particularly the bilateral trade. That would take that would cause a hit, but not nearly as much as the amount of trade, the exports that go from China to the United States, a much bigger share of their economy. So the thought is that it would hurt China more. Then you've got this, if you really want to play it out, there's this Malacca Straits thing. And if the U.S. Navy, if we're really in a war with China and the U.S. Navy decides to shut down the Malacca Straits, that's a huge, huge problem. That's not unlike Japan at the outbreak of World War II in terms of their dependence on importing energy. One of the reasons behind the One Belt, One Road. They're trying to build pipelines, they're trying to build other access for energy imports to come into China that don't have to go through the Malacca Straits. So I think if push came to shove, we'd probably have the upper hand on that. But we don't want to do that. We want to grow our economy. So our economy would take a hit. It's just that it wouldn't be quite as big as China's, in my view. By the way, I forgot to mention the disclaimer up front. Everything I said here was my thoughts. That doesn't represent the Army, the Department of Defense, the Army War College. and certainly some of my colleagues over in SSI, right, David? No. Okay. So what else? We got time for maybe 2 more questions. There in the back.
I just wanted to build upon what you were saying about the fertility. With women becoming more educated, they're going to delay childbirth, and we see that in any developing nation. So I don't necessarily agree. I don't think the desire to have a male child to pass on the name will supersede the delayed fertility option, or for a woman to decide to have a child later once she gets her education. And there's a certain forced retirement that happens in China earlier for women, so now she may only have 20 years in, potentially to work. So I think that it could very well counterbalance that, and I think you will see possibly that fertility rate to still be below 2.0 for a very, very long time.
No, I think that's a great observation, and I think that's the concern that they have. I mean, as a strategist, and I don't think we talk about it too much at the War College, but as a strategist, when you're thinking globally, demographics is really an important subject to figure out, the demographic profile of these various countries and to take that into consideration. So, but they do have that huge imbalance. And so there's a lot of thought. I know every day that we were in China, there was an article in the China Daily, the English language Chinese paper, that was talking about trafficking of women from Vietnam into China, and to try to adjust some of those kind of things. So pretty interesting. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I want to point out something I haven't heard here, and that's the morbidity and mortality statistics for China. So the demographic issue also needs to address the end of life and disease states in China. China really has no effective healthcare delivery system outside of government-run hospitals. As a matter of fact, they also have a cultural time bomb. They are a nation of smokers per capita. Again, this is not a negative comment, but I want to point out that if you look at American Chinese smokers, they have a much higher likelihood of getting a lung cancer. There is a genetic component here, and quite frankly, the rate of lung cancer, specifically non-small cell lung cancer in China, is phenomenal. These folks have no way of dealing with stage 4 lung cancer, which is how these people present a diagnosis. So, does that relate to your 1 to 4 problem? Well, realistically, the 4 problem will be quick. The 2 problem may be a bigger issue. But, I visited there. I have an idea of the healthcare system. I am a doc, and it is mind-boggling to me where they are in terms of healthcare delivery.
No, thanks for that. That's a great observation. And like I said, I mean, there are huge social problems that China needs to overcome. And so when we were there, one of the comments that came from talking to the economist in the U.S. Embassy said that, his projection is that in the not too distant future, China's going to have a guns versus butter problem. We're looking at, China's got their 2nd aircraft carrier on the way, and they're building this blue water navy, and they're modernizing, and they're spending more and more on defense. Well, they are. Some people say about half of what they spend on defense is for internal security. But they're starting to face a lot of these social issues. I mean, I mentioned pollution, and so that's a great observation on healthcare. And so the society is starting, as I mentioned, they're getting wealthier, moving into the middle class. They want better services. They want better health care. They want to end this pollution. So the government's got to respond. So it's going to cost money to respond to those kind of things. And so that's this thought that eventually they're going to run into a guns versus butter problem in terms of how they're going to allocate resources. And that's just going to have an impact. So lots of issues out there from the Chinese economy. Thanks for your attention. And I've got to release you back to your seminars or I'll be in a lot of trouble.